Morning for those of you on the East Coast of the US, and if you are like our speaker sitting in Singapore, good evening, and thank you for joining us what is much later at your end. I'm Jose Alvarez, the Faculty Director of USALI, and this is our weekly speaker series. And I do want to remind folks that these speaker events are generally recorded. And last week, for instance, we had a superb program, our dialogue, the second part of it, on the ethical dilemmas of the Chinese scholar. That recording is now up, and I do urge you to look at that recording as well as prior recordings of these events. So today's event is Remaking American Trade Policy with Asia. So today's guest is Dr. Deborah Elms. Dr. Elms is the founder and executive director of the Asian Trade Center, which works with governments and companies to design better trade policies for the region. She is also president of the Asia Business Trade Association. She served on the Trade and Investment Council of the World Economic Forum from 2017 to 2019, and she's been on the International Technical Advisory Committee of the Global Trade Professionals Alliance, and was chair of the Working Group on Trade Policy and Law. She has been a senior fellow in the Singapore Ministry of Trade and Industries Trade Academy, and was head of the Tomask Foundation Center for Trade and Negotiations and senior fellow of International Political Economy at the San Rasatam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technical University in Singapore. She received a PhD in political science from the University of Washington, and she publishes the Talking Trade blog, and you have a sample of one of her recent blogs that came along with the announcement and RSVP for today's event. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Elms, who addresses us for, I guess, 10, 15 minutes. And we'll have a moderated discussion where I will tee up some questions. And then hopefully you all can join us, and I will tee up questions that appear in our Q&A box. So if you have questions, please write them in at Q&A, and we will reserve at least 20, 25 minutes for that. The event ends as usual at 10:30 our time. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Elms.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's an interesting topic for today. So I'm very delighted to be here with you to discuss this. And in particular, what I want to do is talk about what we know about the Biden administration's plans on trade and trade policy, and then what that looks like from here in Asia. So I'm delighted to get your feedback, starting, of course, with Jose, and then continuing through the Q&A to what I have to say, because I think it's an interesting transition, of course, and I think it's worth reflecting on some of the questions and challenges that the U.S. is going to face, is currently facing, and will continue to face, and then getting a perspective that I think may be slightly different from what you hear normally, particularly those of you on the East Coast and working through Washington. So we're coming off, as you all I'm sure well know, 4 years of highly different US trade policy, in which the Trump administration pursued all kinds of different objectives, used tools out of the US toolkit that in many cases haven't been touched since the 1960s, many of them, and then beyond, including such rare and unusual tools as Section 232 on national security and Section 301 on unfair trade practices. These are tools that the United States clearly had in its toolbox. They had not been revoked or canceled, but they were generally, but not always, reserved for times of direct war or for times when we had a less functional global trading system. In particular with a dispute settlement system in the original GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, that did not provide the kind of protection of US interests that the United States wanted when thinking about unfair trade practices. Trump administration pulled these tools out and then began using them against both adversaries, or what are now called adversaries, but also allied countries alike. And that caught lots of governments around the world off guard. It certainly caught a lot of companies off guard who suddenly found themselves on the receiving end of overnight 25% hikes in their tariffs, for goods moving in and out of the United States. The reason that they were hit for products that were leaving the United States is that when confronted with these unusual trade tactics, many US receiving countries then turned around and slapped retaliatory tariffs against US products. So American firms were caught, as well as firms from around the world, were caught in escalating tariff wars over everything from washing machines and solar panels through to high-tech issues, electronics, footwear, bicycles, you name it. Basically everything caught in these variety of tools. Fast forward to the end of the Trump administration, there was a strong hope, certainly in much of Asia, that some of the disruption in trade that we had just experienced would go away, or at least would dissipate, that many of those tariffs would be removed entirely, or that they would, at the minimum, have a timeline for removal, especially those that were aimed at allies like the Europeans or the Koreans, that had been, in many cases, suspended or discontinued, but nonetheless, the threat remained that they could find themselves back having to pay these tariffs. And so many of the countries in Asia who were at the cutting edge of the challenge wanted a new US administration to come in and adjust tariff policy and try to figure out some way clear to resolving the trade tensions between the US and China, and then for the United States to re-engage on trade and economic policies in Asia, and then more broadly in the World Trade Organization, where the US had been blocking lots of different efforts to reform the organization, and then finally presided over the collapse, as many of the lawyers I'm sure on this call know, the collapse of the dispute settlement system for the moment at the WTO. So there was a lot of enthusiasm when the Biden administration came into office in January. There is still, I would say, a fair amount of enthusiasm across much of Asia for a change in US policy. But what is increasingly obvious to many governments is that it will take longer than they expected for the US to decide what is its new trade orientation. And that's, of course, not unusual, to be honest, because every incoming administration, especially when you switch between parties, has some reflection time that they need to have in place. They need to decide what their priorities are. They need to get their individuals in place. So there's always a lag between the seating of a new president, especially on a new party, and the rolling out of what are those parties' policy objectives. You may recall that the Trump administration took over a year before it actually really began working on trade. So the same things should have been obvious to many people waiting for the Biden administration, but I think they had hoped that there would be changes made much more quickly. And so there's a growing sense, I don't think it's disappointment just yet, but at least a growing sense that this is not going to change as soon as they had hoped. The related challenge to that, of course, is, well, what is US policy going to look like on trade? And that is much less clear. What we've heard a lot about is an attempt to shift US policy towards more worker centrism. But it's unclear to, especially to the outside the US, and maybe it's unclear inside the US, what exactly that means. So what does a worker-centered trade policy look like? Hasn't really been defined particularly well, other than saying what it isn't. And what it isn't is a policy dominated by corporate interests. But that's not particularly helpful. What then is a trade? I mean, how do you define a trade policy that's not corporate, that helps workers? A little unclear. And in particular, if you start thinking about what that worker-centered trade policy looks like, it can be quite concerning if you are outside the US, because it suggests that the US will turn much more inward and be much more focused on protecting particularly US jobs at the expense of engagement overseas. And this is a real challenge here in Asia, where the US has always been very prominent in policymaking. It has had reasonably strong links economically. Of course, security and politics also matters, but I'm just talking about the economic side. And so what does that mean if the United States is now pursuing worker-centered trade policy? Does that mean that the Asian governments are going to count less on the United States? Or does that mean that the United States is going to shift emphasis but continue similar policies? At the moment, it's unclear. And it's unclear as well, and I'll just make this final sort of point, and then I'm happy to switch to conversation around topics that interest you. And I hope that you all are thinking about questions as we go along. It's compounded by some challenges around staffing, which are always an issue. We always have a bit of a staffing issue when you transition from one party to another, because of course the top ranks are replaced. But typically your career staff officers, your career bureaucrats remain throughout and across different administrations. So that's been the case for a very long time. I mean, you'll lose a few people, but in general, your career staff are less concerned about the political ideology of an administration and much more concerned with what are the policy programs that we have underway? Do they need to be adjusted? And if so, by how much? And if not, what are the new opportunities? And sort of navigating their way through these administrative changes is something that career bureaucrats are very comfortable with and very used to doing. So normally when we do have a transition, it takes some time for a review for the top levels to be staffed, especially so many of them now need Senate confirmation. It's always a challenge. But it's worse this transition than normal. And the reason that it's worse is that we have such thin ranks on the ground in the US, in Washington, where particularly on trade, we have so many vacant posts across USTR, the US Trade Representative's Office, across the Commerce Department, across the State Department, including some of the agencies and ministries that we don't think of always as being involved in trade, like Department of Agriculture. Many of those career staff from the top all the way down to junior entry positions have left because they were not interested in pursuing the radically different policies of the Trump administration, and because they decided that they could find, employment elsewhere in many respects, and so they've left. That is actually a real challenge for the US, because as you get a new USTR, and Catherine Tai just began her new job, into place, it's hard for her to be able to assemble really good, thoughts and ideas when she is facing a diminished staff. This is not to suggest that, let me just be clear before I have some complaints from current USTR staff. I'm not suggesting that the people who have remained are somehow, not stellar, but just that there are less of them, and there have been less of them for quite some time. And when you try to create a radically different policy now that's worker-centered, that's more challenging when you have new people who need to be brought in, recruited at all different levels, brought up to speed, familiar with the topics, prepared to engage on this sort of new agenda. And I think that is going to compromise, or at least delay, US interests on trade and economic policy for some time. As you fill out those ranks, as you decide what your policy is, there's going to be a gap that I think is going to be quite long. I suspect that for many US trade officials or US economic officials, the hope at this point is that by November, US will have many of its ducks in a row, because there are some very important meetings at the end of this year that require US engagement, and that require the US to show up and actually be able to articulate what are their policy positions, what are the objectives that they're trying to pursue, and then what are the ways in which they intend to work together to achieve those outcomes. And so some of the meetings that I'll mention briefly, and again, we can discuss this in more detail, things like, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, holds its Leader Summit. This year it's earlier than normal, so it will be in October. ASEAN Summit is always followed by APEC's Summit. APEC is, ASEAN may be virtual. APEC is certainly virtual this year. So we don't have the same sort of travel to Asia that we used to have, but those two things are happening. And then in addition to the climate change convention this year, we also have, at long last, the WTO 12th Ministerial is meant to be held in Geneva at the end of the year. And so there's at least 3 or 4 major trade events towards the end of the year in which the United States will be expected to attend, and people will be waiting to hear what the US has to say when it engages in these different activities with these countries that are involved in all of these different configurations. And so I think there's an opportunity for the United States to figure out what it wants to do, but it will have to start showing up to meetings, I would say by November at the latest, with some clearer sense of what actually they intend to do or what they intend to deliver under a Biden administration's worker-centered trade policy by the time they get to the end of this year. So let me stop there, and then we can have a conversation about these issues. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you. You teed up quite a number of them. And I guess I'll start with your mentioning of Catherine Tai as the new U.S. trade rep. And obviously, this conversation is partly predictions, but partly recommendations. So how do you see her views with respect to Asia and trade policy? I mean, she's most known for, of course, ushering through the USMCA. She had huge bipartisan support. I think she was one of the rare Biden nominees that got unanimous vote, I believe. That suggests that she has quite a bit of credibility on the Hill. So can you say a bit more about what you both predict and recommend her position to be?
Great. I mean, as you mentioned, she has excellent links with Congress. And I think she was recruited in large part because of those links. If the United States intends under a Biden term to push forward trade policy that requires congressional approval, then obviously good links with Congress is absolutely critical. And there were many members of Congress, and I would argue this is on both parties, who were not so satisfied with the previous administration's attempts to engage with Congress, where Congress felt like they had been cut out of the loop, that they were not relevant, that they had very little to say, particularly trade and economics, but in other areas as well. But I'll just stick again to just trade and economics. And so I think the recruitment of Tai as USTR is in part an effort to signal to Congress that your voice matters. We've chosen someone who understands your concerns. And as we pivot US policy to be more accommodating of what we think, especially the Democratic Party on the Hill wants to see, she is in a good place to articulate that. She has a second strength that I think was absolutely critical in choosing her, which is her strength on China, which is a big part, or will be a big part, of course, of the US plans for the future. How does the US tackle China? And then with her own background and her own level of interest in this topic, I think they thought it was a sort of good marriage of someone who knows Congress and someone who knows about one of the key issues that is likely to be across the entire Biden administration, however long that happens to be. So she is, they thought, filling two key gaps in their objectives. So now, what is she going to do? Let me just give you some brief. She got a lot of challenges on her plate. Yeah. You know, as an example, many of the preference programs for the United States expired. So GSP expired, the Generalized System of Preferences. So many of US developing country and least developed country allies do not have access to the US market on preferential terms. So they're suddenly paying duties and tariffs. This is a huge problem if you're a developing country, because the US remains one of the most lucrative markets for global exports. And so when you lose preferential access to the US market, it's a challenge. So you've got to get renewed GSP. There are complaints in Congress about what that looks like. That's going to be key for her. We lose another key logistical problem is we lose Trade Promotion Authority, TPA, on July 1st. And that means that this administration will not be able to engage in any kind of trade negotiations until it gets either TPA extended, renewed, or gets a new set of instructions around TPA. But basically, she will lose the ability to negotiate on trade on July 1st, and she will have to figure out how do you solve that particular conundrum. And then she's got a whole range of trade agreement challenges ahead of her. How will the US proceed on trade and economic issues? How engaged can it be? What are the challenges that it faces when these other agreements like CPTPP and this new Asian regional agreement, RCEP, get going? What are the competitive challenges the United States faces? And then how does it engage in the region, especially in Asia? And then the final one, and again, we could go on at this forever, but let me just make one more, which is WTO. What is the United States going to do on the World Trade Organization's agenda in general? How will it resolve some of the burning issues that are still unresolved with the WTO processes? Then with the reform agenda at the WTO, and then how will we fix the dispute settlement challenges at the WTO? So in Geneva, there is another long laundry list of challenges the United States has to tackle. Yeah. So I think that's at least sets to set some of the stage of, I mean, this is a tough job she's just inherited.
Right. So can you say a bit more about her China posture and expertise? Because that has not been as much in the news, at least the ones that I follow. So fill us in on what her posture is, what her experience is with respect to China.
I suspect that one of the challenges with talking about the Biden administration remains, I mean, even though we're now into April, a lack of clarity about what exactly does this mean. And I understand if I was in the Biden team, I would be just as happy to stay as vague as long as possible. So if you're all happy with me saying things like, you know, it's important that we remain competitive and the US wants to engage with allies and we're going to work on workers, and we left it at that, I'd be delighted. I would say, fantastic. I've survived another day and I don't have to be specific. Great. But at some point you are going to have to be specific. And I think what they liked about Ty is not, again, Capitol Hill, absolutely critical, but she has a long demonstrated experience and at least interest, as I understand it, in China. And because this entire administration is thinking very actively, as did the last one, about China rise, China's objectives, US responses to China, and then what that looks like both bilaterally, but then also what that looks like in a larger context. I think they thought she was a nice addition to the grouping of policymakers in the White House, especially, who are thinking about US relations with China. I don't think she would necessarily put herself down as a China expert, but she has more knowledge on the topic than many of the other potential candidates might have had. And I think for a US administration that anticipates trade and economic challenges from China for at least the coming few years and potentially decades, that was a key selling point for her candidacy.
Does she actually speak the language? You know?
I think she does, but to be honest, I have not met anyone who said that they've talked to her in Mandarin and that they think her Mandarin is anything fantastic, dreadful. I have no idea.
Right. So
it was a real problem, though. I will tell you that the lack of Mandarin speaking was a real problem under the last administration, because they were having these bilateral discussions with China with no Mandarin speakers on staff and without bringing their own interpreters. So we were getting Chinese interpreters to translate for the US side, which I think is like I don't know why this seemed like a good idea to anyone, but that's what was happening. So having more Mandarin speakers and having more Mandarin speakers who can attend meetings and listen, and then they can at least make sure that the translation matches what they hear as the appropriate translation, I think is critical.
So one thing that comes out of your introductory remarks is the expectation that there'll be a radical change with Biden on a trade policy. And I guess, and you mentioned that the frustration right now is that, well, how long will it take? But I guess I want to ask you whether you really think there will be a radical change with respect to China. That is, this is a dominant theme. I don't see much talk in the Biden administration or among Democrats that is that different from what I hear from the Republican side of the aisle. In fact, I see a hardening of positions. So I see this administration as taking seriously the idea that there is a genocide going on in China, and that's going to affect trade policy, even though it may be a political issue. So can you say something about the China end of policy and whether you really expect to be a real change?
No. So I think we've had a clear break in past trade policies, starting with Trump. It will continue to a certain extent under Biden. I think they may refashion some of the focus. So the Trump administration was less concerned about human rights as a topic, less concerned about democracy as a topic, less worried about worker rights as a topic than this administration. Now, it may be the case that the policy looks the same, but the justification has been or will change. So you're still pursuing a very aggressive stance against China, but your reasons for doing so are different. Now, we can have a great intellectual conversation about whether or not that makes a difference. As long as the outcome is the same, what difference does it make what the justification is? But I think that this administration will be pursuing at least different positions for the kinds of policy decisions they make. So it will be, again, much more focused: human rights, labor rights, environment, worker rights. Those will come to the fore. Those are sort of long-standing and traditional democratic concerns from the Democratic Party that will come forward again. Now, one of the things that has been really fascinating across the last 4 years watching trade policy in the US is the scrambling of policy positions by the two parties. So traditionally, Democrats were more hostile to trade. They were much more concerned about, again, as I said, these sort of traditional areas: human rights, labor rights, environment, which led them to be less open to the idea of market opening, because they said, oh, that just allows race to the bottom for environment, human rights, et cetera. Big problem. So hostile to trade. The Trump administration plus COVID has strangely actually made the Democratic Party, or at least when you poll Democrats, more favorably inclined to trade. So they actually like trade more than they've ever liked trade, including many of the new candidates who are sitting on Capitol Hill seem to be more pro-trade. Now contrast that with the strange flipping in the Republican Party. So the Republican Party traditionally in favor of trade, in favor of open markets. We could go on, but basically under the Trump administration, a complete shift under the Republican Party of their views towards trade. And so one of the other issues that Ty and the White House have to grapple with is, how do we know where those parties sit now on trade? They're universal at the moment in being hostile to China, but that's not a very good policy position, really. We're just hostile to China. It doesn't give you any sense of what do I do with that? Like, how do I pursue that? How do I put that into action? What are the actual policies I intend to pursue? What are the outcomes I'm trying to achieve? That, I think, is unclear, other than sort of a generalized hostility to China. Where do we go with that? And on all of these other issues, I think it's less clear. So what are the other areas that the US will pursue on trade that are not China focused, or that are China focused but in other areas? As an example, how will the United States deal with the rest of Asia on trade and economic issues in particular, but security politics as well? Unclear, because it can't just be all China all the time. As important as China may be, there is the rest of the world out there that has to be managed as well. And I think it's not yet obvious what those policies will look like, but I think you're right in diagnosing that there will be more continuities than maybe expected. So the hostility to China continues. Tariffs on Chinese goods probably will continue for maybe forever. I hope not, just on behalf of firms that are struggling. Like, what a mess. There will be similar kinds of policies in terms of using heavy enforcement, but the justification for that, I think, is going to shift. So instead of doing heavy enforcement because direct national security, I think you're going to hear instead heavy enforcement because you don't protect worker rights. So it'll be this potentially similar kinds of tools, actually, but I think that, again, the justification will be different, which may lead you to use different sorts of policy tools to get different sorts of objectives.
Right, and so I myself have predicted that the tariffs on Chinese goods will continue, but citing perhaps different rationales. But they may change in a way that will affect corporate business interests more directly. So you're probably aware of lots of initiatives on the Hill that would target particular businesses who do business in Shanghai, right? So the idea here would be, we would really target people where it hurts. We will start identifying Hollywood companies that shouldn't be filming movies in that region, and so forth. You're far more connected to businesses than I am. How worried are they that the human rights focus will shift and turn against them?
Okay, so we have a couple of different issues here, all sort of rolled up together. So let me just talk about the broader decoupling. We've had this argument that the US and China are decoupling, should decouple, and that businesses should no longer run supply chains through China. That broader argument is not getting a lot of traction among businesses, including American businesses, because they say, how can we ignore China? It's 1 billion plus people. It's a massive market. It is growing at rates that no one else is growing at. It has the potential to make or break firms. So if nothing else, we need to be in China because we need to be in China. So where we have the ability to continue to remain in China, to deliver to the domestic market, we shall do so. But China is also a great place to do business, if you're a business, because it has an infrastructure no one else can match. So there have been firms who have said, okay, you know what, this is getting complicated and I don't want to face risk and uncertainty around policies, tariff or otherwise. We will move out of China. Fantastic. And you say, great, where are you going to go? Where are you going to go? And actually you start to do the sort of calculations. You say, well, you know, I could go to Vietnam, I could go to Mexico, I could go to Poland. And firms are doing that. Some firms are doing that. But the reality of moving your supply chain is not as easy. I mean, people like the media sort of suggest that you just go, boom, gosh, we should be in Vietnam. And next day we're in Vietnam. No, it's very difficult. It's expensive. It's complicated. It's a bitch under COVID because you can't get anybody in and out. You can't get people on the ground to look at space. You can't recruit people. You can't get your staff in. I mean, it is a nightmare to move people and move companies, especially COVID, of course. So that's a challenge. How are we going to manage that movement of supply chains? And even if we could do so, let's imagine, sake of argument, we found the perfect location in Vietnam. We're going to set our factory up. I've got the staff, everything else. I'm ready to make, I don't know, ballpoint pens. So I can start this tomorrow. The challenge then for many firms is I can get someone in there to make ballpoint pens. But what Vietnam is missing that China has is we decide we don't want to just make it in purple. We also want to make it in black and we want to make it in green. You know, the Chinese can do this in like 2 minutes. They can switch up the plastics from purple to green to black. If you don't like the color of the ink, they'll get someone else who's got new ink. They have all the people right there who do boxes and packaging and labeling and who can ship it. That whole ecosystem of support for companies is in China. That ecosystem of support is not anywhere else. And your costs are just going to be way higher, even if labor costs are less. So that's proven to be a real challenge for firms. So even if you said, I don't care about the China market, I'm happy to move, logistically, it's harder to move a supply chain than you would expect. And then as an additional challenge, for many firms, they're saying, well, actually, I'm a little nervous about moving because what if I get hit now with some new problem? And so under the Trump administration, as an example, we saw firms that were moving out of China into Vietnam, which led Vietnam's trade deficit with the United States to skyrocket. This was the key metric under the Trump administration. And many firms started to get nervous. Well, what happens if targeting China suddenly becomes targeting Vietnam? And now I'm caught again. Right. So I think firms generally are less enthusiastic about following the sort of, winds of change in Washington than people expect, with a few exceptions. So firms do not like heavy risk. And there is a growing risk of backlash, both in China against American firms especially, but also in Washington against American firms that are in China. And if that is a real problem for a firm, then they may say, bite the bullet and I'll move and we'll reset up in Poland, which is a very common location, or Mexico. So these are the winners out of this whole reshuffling of supply chains so far: Vietnam, Poland, Mexico, because they have infrastructure, they have connectivity, they have lots of trade agreements. So they're doing quite well. And the firms will just say, that's it, the risk is too high, I'm out of here.
So, and I guess sort of the backdrop for what you're saying is these are long-term changes that companies would have to make. And I suppose some of them are hedging, because after all, Trump got 70 million plus votes. Somebody like him or him could be back in office in 4 years. So one of the challenges, surely, from the perspective of Asia, is how long-term a change would there be, especially if it takes another year for it to be in place. So can you say more about the sort of the short time fuse here of a potential one-term Biden administration?
I think in Asia, there was no sense that the US could make such a fast pivot on so many things so quickly. And so the Trump administration was a huge shock to Asia. Lots of folks in Asia, certainly, probably globally, but I am only going to talk about Asia, because they had not anticipated that the United States, which had been very, like a super tanker headed in the same general direction, it might have varied a little, but basically you knew where it was going, would suddenly pivot and go to another place entirely. Like this concept was just unbelievable, and yet it happened. And so now you find in Asia, especially governments, but also companies, have lost that trust in the US. And I think it is hard for folks in the US to appreciate the extent to which that is damaging. And the example that I give is, you know how you, and I'm not going to suggest the United States was a parent, but it's that same kind of sense. Like when you're a kid and your parent just doesn't do anything wrong, and then you suddenly have something happen where you realize that actually this parent is a person and this person can make a mistake. And like that's sort of like the moment when your brain shifts from this is like a unfallible God to a normal person who can make mistakes, is that same kind of mental shift that I think you're seeing now, which is the US may not be a reliable ally. Oh my heavens. Now that is something, or at least may not be reliable. Even if you're not allied with the US, you knew what they were going to do. But now suddenly you don't know. You don't. So even if the Biden administration shows up and they say, you know, forget the last 4 years, we're going to do something totally different and still back the way it was, much of Asia especially is saying, yeah, not so fast. Because how do we know you're going to stay in office, as you just pointed out? How do we know what comes next? And once you plant that seed in someone's head that, wait a second, we have to hedge our bets a little here, that picks up steam very quickly. So you combine this agenda, which appears to be inward focused, right? America workers first, which is now going into basically, in some ways, its fifth year, right? What's the difference between worker centered and America first? Little unclear from the outside. So 5 years of inward looking US, and why should I continue to rely on the US for lots of different things, including trade economic issues? It's a real problem.
So one thing that comes out of your initial remarks that I guess I want to ask you about is you describe a sort of common Asia posture with respect to adverse or shock, with respect to Trump's unilateralism and use of 301, et cetera, and common hope that that things will get back to normal under Biden. But I guess I want to push back. Asia is a big region. Is there really a common position among Asian states? Weren't there some states that sort of liked what Trump was doing, either because they disliked China or because they were suspicious of free trade to begin with? Japan, China, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, do they really have common trade policy?
That's a great question. And yes, it's a complicated and diverse place. So you're right that there are variations between them. But what I would say is, love it or dislike it, you felt like you knew what the United States was roughly going to do. It was going to pursue these kinds of things. It would be sometimes more focused on democracy, sometimes less, sometimes more focused on human rights, sometimes less, sometimes more focused on free trade, trade liberalization, market access, sometimes less. But it wasn't like it careened out of the Suez Canal into some other body of water altogether. Like you knew where it was going to go. And now that has shifted. So even if you are a fan of where it went, and there are certainly both governments and certainly companies in the region that are a fan of a much tougher line on China, a fan of renewed emphasis on democracy, a big fan of worker rights or labor or whatever. I mean, there's a lot of different groups that you could come up with. There is still a concern about what does that look like and how far off the sort of normal path does that take the US, and is it reliable on that path? Even if I think it's a great idea that we've now pivoted to something else, is that just going to be dissipated under the next thing? And now we're just going to have huge swings in US policy? Or, I think so, even for those who are in favor of adjustments in US policy, however you define them, I think there's a lingering concern about the stability of those changes and then the length of time that they will remain in place before something else happens. And I think that is a challenge. And I don't know how you fix that if you're the US. If I'm Catherine Tai, how do I fix that? I tell you we're going to be different. I tell you we're going to be engaged. I tell you, but you don't trust me. So how do I rebuild that sort of trust and engagement? I think that's tough.
So would one way be to actually seriously re-engage in the CPTPP which Trump, of course, left left it there. We hadn't ratified, of course, but it was fully concluded, and left it there in the first days in office. Now, most people that I talk to think that that's highly unlikely, and Biden himself has said that in the short term he doesn't see his entering into free trade. But there are, op-eds by powerful people, including Jim Bacchus and others, saying that this should be a top priority. And of course, going back into it would take quite a bit. So I'm curious what you have to say about not so much the likelihood, but what it would take. Would the U.S. have to insist on a renegotiation? The reason that I'm curious about that is, at least on the investment chapter side, which I've looked at quite closely, the TPP's investment chapter, which remains pretty much the same, was over 80% the exact language of the U.S. model bilateral investment treaty at the time. So the investment chapter is U.S. policy, right? So, and of course, it does include investor-state dispute settlement, which is, somewhat dissipated in the USMCA and all of that. But still, would it take a insistence on renegotiation for the U.S. to come back into something as ambitious as the TPP? And I guess from the standpoint of Asia, would Asian governments really want a renegotiation just to have the U.S. back?
Well, that's a lot of questions. So I obviously a big fan of TPP, big fan of CPTPP, been working very hard to make sure that it's implemented effectively. We're working on accession of new members right now, so I'm a big fan. I think it was a hugely destructive move for the United States to get out. So in that sense, of course, the United States should get back in. But I also recognize the practical challenges around getting the US back in, starting with the fact there's no TPA in place. So you have to get the permission to do the entry. Unless, I actually think, those of you lawyers on this call, there have got to be some creative language, legal language, that you could use, like a little loophole that says, oh, we already had TPA from when we first did TPP. We're using that as justification for getting into CPTPP now. So you could, I think, maybe maneuver this in some clever way. I think it could be done, but it still leaves you with what does the United States want out of a trade agreement? And the current plan on TPP is, this is the rule book, and the rule book is unchanged from when you left, with the exception of 22 different provisions, 19 of which were suspended, and 2 of which they had drafting errors and they fixed them. So with some new negotiated areas around things like accession that have come in since the CPTPP started. So the agreement is the same agreement the United States left. And the rules for accession are, this is the rule book. You don't get to touch it. The whole thing. So the UK currently looking to join, this is the rule book. Here it is. Figure out how this works with you. Here are all of our texts and schedules for goods and services, investment with natural persons movements, et cetera, state-owned enterprises. Those are not changing. So we're not touching anything we've already done. And basically you are coming in and all we're talking about is your own, UK's own market access schedules for goods, services, investment, et cetera. The rest stays unchanged. Now, so that's supposed to be the model for joining the CPTPP. Now, this gets very tricky though in a hurry if you're not talking about the UK. So UK, we're going to do that. Thailand, we would do that. Korea, we'll do the same thing. What if it's the US? And what if it's China? That's where I think it gets hard, because I don't think that the current 7 members of the CPTPP can sit up and confidently say to the Americans or the Chinese, take it or leave it. This is the text. These are the rules. This is the schedules. We're not budging. You come in as a much bigger player than any of us, and we will tell you what you get and what you don't get. I think that's a non-starter for both the US and for China, frankly, because they would say, well, among other things, the TPP was originally finished in 2016, which is now in the trade world like a lifetime ago. I mean, it's not quite as bad as the WTO, but it's still a lifetime ago. So there are provisions in here that should probably be updated. And so then you say, well, great, let's update those. But as soon as you start to, which is the problem we had when the TPP became the CPTPP, as soon as you start to unpluck pieces of this, adjust a sentence here, remove something there, quickly that sort of balance unravels, and you end up saying, well, are we going to do another 8 years of negotiation to get us back to something that we can agree on that looks very similar to what we had, but is now different? I think this is a real challenge. Where do we go from here in order to get the United States or the Chinese or both in? I think this is hard. I mean, it's the obvious answer for the US, the most obvious answer for the US. How do you become economically re-engaged in Asia? You pick up where you left off on the TPP. That's easy. The politics of that, though, in Washington is just, I think, so poisonous. I just can't imagine how you would do it, which means that now you've got to bludgeon the current members into allowing the US to change things. And I think the current members would say, wait a second, you led us all the way up to the altar. You left us standing there at the altar. Why would I do that again? Like, I already did that once. I don't want to do it one more time. So I think, again, great idea, politically really impossible. And I just think with the current members, although they clearly want the US in, particularly like Japan, making it happen is harder than people imagine.
And I just want to clarify, the current members, would they be equally enthusiastic about letting China in?
Well, therein lies another great question, right? Officially, TPP from the beginning was APEC. So the whole reason why we have TPP was this was an APEC initiative from way back. And members were observing that APEC on its own cannot negotiate. So if you want to get a free trade area of the Asia Pacific in APEC at the 21 member economies, you have to use a different vehicle to get there. So TPP, the original P4, then the TPP, became the vehicle to get to APEC. So all APEC members, all 21 members were asked to join. China was asked to join. I'm sure to everyone's great relief, they said, no, thank you, not now. But if China now comes back and they say, actually, you know what, we're willing to live by this rule book. We're willing to take on all of this stuff. We're willing to do the new rules on IP. We're willing to abide by the state-owned enterprise stuff. We're happy to deal with the standards and compliance. We're even fine with cross-border data flows as written in the CPTPP. It would be a challenge, I think, for the current members to say, no, thank you, we don't want you in. Even though politically, again, sort of from an economic perspective, crucial. Politically, wow, that gets challenging. And would the current members like that? The current members are going to be like, please don't make us choose. Please don't make us choose. Please let us not have to make this choice. And if we do, please let us not have to, let it not affect what happens with the US. Because if you get China in, does the US never come in? If you get the US in, does China never come in? Can you get them back in at the same time? Wow, that's a nightmare. Like, there's just no good scenario for how we solve this.
Yeah, because I frankly don't see, if China is in, why the US would be in, right? Or politically, how you sell that right now.
I think I would argue, actually, I would do the opposite. I would say if China is in, fabulous. Isn't that amazing? We got them to agree to our rules. Like, we wrote these. How fabulous is that? Now we can hold them accountable and it would be great. But politically in the US, wow, that would be, you'd have to be one heck of a salesman in order to get that through.
Right. I mean, it's just unimaginable to me that we would ever get back to the days of negotiating, for example, a US-China bilateral investment treaty, which was actually quite close to completion at one point. And it's hard to imagine anything like that being on the agenda. We will soon turn to Q&A. So I strongly urge folks that are putting their questions in the chat to put them in the Q&A box. And I will start looking at that. But let's discuss a little bit the WTO, which I think we haven't discussed. So everybody assumes that the Biden administration wants to re-engage with the WTO and not just say, hey, we might just leave, as Trump did. And that re-engagement would have to be, as I think you mentioned, both restoring it as a negotiating forum for future trade rules, but also restoring its dispute settlement mechanism. China seems to be very supportive of at least restoring the dispute settlement mechanism. Can you say a bit more about what Biden's policy ought to be with respect to the WTO on those two issues, and how does that say something about what China is up to with the WTO?
Well, that's a great question. So, clearly the WTO is better off with an engaged US involved in solving the challenges that face the global economic system. Much better. And I think even for detractors of the United States, they would say we still are better off when especially when the bigger players play by at least some of the rules of the WTO and do not take matters in their own hands.
Right.
Doesn't solve all of our challenges. We still have competitiveness problems and so forth, but it's better to have the majors in than the majors out. So yay. But then again, you get back to this, like, okay, well, what is the United States actually going to do okay, let me be clear. Some people would say the US has always been engaged at the WTO across the last 4 years, which is sort of true, but they weren't engaged in a way of solving problems. They were much more engaged in a practice of flagging challenges and then blocking action. So this team needs to do more than just block action. They need to identify some challenges, and then they need to come up with some mechanisms that they would be in favor of that could resolve those issues, including the dispute system, which has been very favorable to the United States and is a problem when you don't have it, because then you are left with unilateral tools and measures, which we have seen the United States do, but they also have all kinds of damage, both to the US economy and to the global economy and so forth. So much better if we can engage. I think the dispute settlement system, though, and I think you probably know this better than I do anyways, but the dispute settlement system at the WTO and the kind of dispute settlement systems that we tend to have replicated in trade agreements is under a certain amount of threat, because governments are less enthusiastic about participating in these exercises, growing concerns about the process itself, the length, the cost, the difficulties with enforcement with the current mechanisms, however we use them. And so there is a growing movement to rethink how we handle disputes and rethink the way in which we resolve those disputes. But I don't think we're yet at a point where you can say, this is the set of policies we prefer, these are the set of policies we don't prefer. I don't think we're there yet. And the challenge is, do you just leave the system broken, the appellate body part at least broken, until you get to that point? Or do you say, let's just reactivate the appellate body while we have these conversations? I could make an argument either way. You remove the pressure if you fix it, if you sort of go back to the way it was. You don't solve the problem, but at least you say now it's functioning, and then we will come up with a better system. Or do you say, no, actually that pressure is really crucial. Having it broken is solving problems that we haven't been able to address in a long period of time. And this is a conundrum. I'm at a loss. I mean, I don't know. I had to do a thing yesterday with WTO members on the investment facilitation framework.
Yes.
I mean, I just felt such despair at the end of that whole conversation, because we had delegates from Geneva who were on, who basically were like, unless I get special differential treatment, I'm not going to do this. And unless we do this, I'm not going to do that. And I just thought, like, you're not going to get anything unless we have a cooperative spirit of enterprise. And I just don't know that the WTO at the moment has any sort of cooperative spirit of enterprise. And without that, how does a multilateral system work?
Well, so this is an area of deep concern for me, because investment facilitation should be the easy part of the show. Right? I mean, we have UNCTAD telling us, and this is outdated data, that there's $4.5 trillion gap of money that needs to come principally from the private sector in order to get at crucial sustainable development goals like clean water, pandemic situations where you can actually have decent healthcare, never mind mitigating climate change. All the progressive stuff that Democrats in theory would support require FDI flows. And yet you're telling me that even the trade facilitation agenda, which is not, as far as I know, subject to dispute settlement as it's currently discussed, is tricky. Can you say more about who is it that opposes foreign investment or capital flows into Asia?
It's less of an issue in Asia. So Asia's a big place, but certainly the 15 members that just finished RCEP are very enthusiastic about inbound investment. And the investment chapter in RCEP is quite ambitious. And the investment commitments for market access on investment is extremely strong, I think, especially for Asia. Like, this is amazing. So these are countries that get investment. They understand you can't get where you want to go if you don't have inbound investment. It's part of stimulating your domestic economy, then you export. They get it. But the larger WTO setting includes many countries who are less comfortable with foreign investment because it is viewed as, you come in and you take my resources or whatever, and then you take off the profits and I don't get anything from that. And so the investment facilitation agreement itself is a problem. And then it's a part of this dysfunctional WTO system where, rather than roll up our sleeves and figure out what does this thing look like. Now, let me just be clear. They're not even talking about market access. We're talking about like a framework that will discuss investment. And it's not even among all the members. It's among a subset of the members. Even that is challenging because the members will say, well, I'm not certain that that qualifies as investment. I don't know what it means to facilitate. So, we're still arguing about definitional things, which I think, wow, how in the world are you going to get investment? And so in my thing that I had to do yesterday, I lost my temper a little bit. And I said, investors can go anywhere in the world. And so if you're too difficult, if your government is too challenging, I am not coming to your country. The world is big. Right. And you probably are sitting on not a whole lot that someone else doesn't have elsewhere. So right. I'm going to go somewhere else.
Right.
So, it just reminded me again of like why the WTO is stuck. It's stuck for many reasons, but one of the reasons it's stuck is that we've sort of lost that collective sense of we're trying to accomplish something together and we all need to join our arms and get it done.
Right.
And so if you don't have that collective motivation, then I don't know how the WTO moves forward at the moment, which is so disheartening because, I've spent a career trying to get people to think creatively about trade and about trying to use trade to get development. Like, that's why I think trade matters so much. That's the fastest, easiest route to development that we have. It's not perfect. It doesn't solve everything, but it's still better than all the alternatives.
Right.
And so to watch countries that, especially developing countries, come up with arguments that are anti-trade, I just think, what a shame. What a shame.
So is there prospect that we can get at many of these goals through regional agreements and leave the WTO sort of paralyzed? That is, you've mentioned the RCEP and we've mentioned the TPP. We have the EU-China investment agreement, which I regard as very weak, at least with respect to dispute settlement. It's non-existent. But how should we think about regionalism as an alternative, especially with Asia?
Asia has picked regionalism. Asia has said, as a collective, we believe in the power of trade. We see it all across all of the markets. We see the difference that trade has made in our lifetime and in the lifetime of our families. We are still in favor of trade. We get that it doesn't solve all problems. There's still a little bit of growing backlash in some places, Singapore in particular, but as a whole, as a group, trade matters. So we're going to do however we have to do it. If that means we do bilateral trade agreements, we have lots of those. If that means we do regional ones, fantastic. If we do different configurations in different areas, fantastic. Should we try sector-specific FTAs or sector-specific agreements like on digital? Great, let's give that a try. Asia doesn't really care how you get it done as long as you keep pushing the ball forward. The challenge, of course, is that not everyone is in Asia. And so then you start to create this proliferation of rules and standards and objectives that don't always come together. It is really hard for small firms to move when the world is divided up. And we have large parts of the world that aren't included in these regional agreements. Most notably, I would highlight the United States is not in most of these trade arrangements.
Right.
And so the more that they get signed, the worse the US position, competitive position gets, and the more isolated it gets. So it's a real challenge. Like, how do we solve this? One solution that seems to be making a lot more traction is regional deals, bigger regional deals.
Right. But I guess one of the things you've mentioned, and I'm glad you highlighted, is that these trade agreements are not just about lowering tariffs and getting countries to agree to accept more, trade in goods as well as capital flows. They're about harmonizing regulatory rules, right? Everything from intellectual property to rules of origin. And that's what I think you're suggesting cannot be accomplished through regionalism. And so I guess what you're saying is the businesses that you're in touch with that's as important to them as whether or not they have access to arbitration to solve their disputes. Am I hearing you properly?
Yeah, so I think when you start talking to companies about the things that matter to them, you get a bit disheartened if your world is on trade agreements, because you realize that what matters to them is not often what is in a trade agreement. Like, what matters to them is, how fast can I get things through customs? What are the rules that customs authorities are going to ask me about? How do I get the right labels on my packages to get them in? How do I do better marketing of my products in different foreign markets? I mean, it's things that are not on a trade agreement, you know. And sometimes it's things that are in a trade agreement, but they're very thin. Like, you know, how do I prove that my tapioca pudding meets health standards? Like, that is sort of, but only like this much in a trade agreement, you know, but that's really critical. Obviously, if I'm trying to sell food products, how do I get them tested to ensure that they meet the requirements in the export market is challenging. And how do I find information about that? And so it's, you know, it's trade agreements for me are useful because they do a couple of things. One is they set better boundaries around what are the likely rules. Nobody follows them 100%. So you can't be guaranteed that all of the provisions in any FTA are followed, but at least it gives you some better clarity about what the rules ought to be. And it gives you some consistency across these agreements. I think that's very helpful. And they can be leveraged by governments to implement those rules at the domestic level. Because at the end of the day, again, if this is just a piece of paper that just sits in my drawer, it's a fat lot of good it does any of us. No, I need to make sure that the rules actually get carried through and implemented on the ground. And that, for many governments, is why they are joining these bigger regional agreements, is to take advantage of that opportunity to push through sometimes unpopular reforms in IP, in standards, in opening up previously really protected services sectors, as an example. So there's lots of things that a government can do to leverage an FTA.
Right. So I guess we'll soon turn to the questions, but there are not as many on the queue. So I, if you don't mind, I'll pursue a few of my own. So we're about in US Asia Institute to do in June a program on how does Asia look at investor state dispute settlement and reform. But I guess I'll ask the broader question. Are there conversations in APEC or in ASEAN to develop a common Asia position when it comes to things like, what do we want out of WTO reform on dispute settlement, for instance? Is there a growing posture where you can see Asian governments at least discuss that we better have a common position going into what is likely to be an era of reform for both investor state dispute settlement as well as WTO?
So we've just come through 8 years of often fraught conversations in RCEP among the original 16. So all 10 members of ASEAN, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and India as part of RCEP around ISDS. Because the original leader statement for RCEP back in 2012 said the agreement has to have ISDS. So they wrote ISDS. It was extremely controversial. The investment teams took forever to figure out what the investment rules would look like, what the market access provisions would be around investment, what they have a very long section and it took forever to write. What is expropriation? What does that mean? And then there's a very long section that's actually longer than the original chapter part on ISDS. So all done, very complicated, lot of effort. And then we had a government change in New Zealand. And the new government in New Zealand said, we will never sign another ISDS commitment. So then this left RCEP in a real bind because they had just negotiated the whole thing. They'd gotten it more or less locked down, ready to go. Now what are we going to do? So the RCEP solution at the moment on ISDS is there is no investor protection. We have a very good, I think a pretty good investor chapter. It has a long section on what does it mean to expropriate. And then there's like a little, basically, if you think about the chapter, there's a little section at the end that says coming soon, protection. You know, so basically within 2 years from the date of entry into force, they are to discuss a mechanism to handle disputes to be finished within 5 years. So I think you can think of the chapter and then the ... coming soon to a theater near you is an investment mechanism. You know, somewhere between now and 6 years from now, we will have supposedly an investment mechanism. And I think what this did is it caused this whole conversation in RCEP about what do we want out of an investment mechanism? What should it look like? What are the alternatives? And of course, as we get into this discussion in Asia with the members, there will be even more discussion about what does that investment mechanism look like? And then what are the alternatives and how could we get to something that satisfies everyone? And so that could be the start of conversations around revised ISDS. The dispute settlement part of RCEP, separate chapter, state-to-state dispute, that looks very similar to many other dispute settlement mechanisms. And that was signed off by everyone. So state-to-state dispute, enthusiastic chapter, but they're not governments that necessarily are litigious. So I don't know whether they will use it, even though they have one available. So I think there is a lot of discussions that will be happening around investments disputes and then state-to-state disputes in general. And then the last thing that I would just say on this point is you said, are they going to come together to have these conversations? RCEP was not set up for this purpose. It was set up to sort of harmonize this spaghetti bowl of 5 existing ASEAN agreements and just roll them into one and make RCEP. But now that it's started, and we will have a secretariat for it, I think it is very likely that RCEP countries will start to come together and make rules and make standards and make provisions. And because the mechanism is very much like ASEAN, which is to say we're about to start officials meetings 4 times a year, ministers meetings twice a year, and then leaders summits every year. And when you do that in Asia, you have to have something that your minister will sign and will get his picture in the newspaper. And the minister has to have something that he can hand to his leader, and they're almost all men, sadly, in Asia still, but give to his leader, who will also have something that they can trumpet and say, this is what RCEP did this year. So that mechanism itself, I think, will lead to new rules in Asia on Asian trade and economic issues. It wasn't designed that way from the beginning, but now that it's started, I think we're going to see real, potentially, new rulemaking come from Asia on issues that could be large and small. And we haven't had that before. And then once you start to develop that familiarity, that should carry over to other venues like the WTO, where you should see more cooperation at the WTO about Asian ideas, which you don't see right now. Even ASEAN does not negotiate as a bloc at the WTO. So I think that some of that could be transferred back to the WTO setting, and they could say, look, let's look at what we've done. Here's how we've solved it. We're very diverse, 15 countries from the richest to the poorest, biggest to the tiniest, you fill in all the blanks you want. We're diverse. We solved it. Why can't we at the WTO?
You did mention Singapore and being somewhat unusual. And what I know is, for example, it's big push to have this mediation alternative through this mediation treaty. But I saw a lot of signatories, but very few ratifiers for that treaty. And so I'm a bit skeptical about the role of mediation or state-to-state dispute settlement, at least on the investment issues that I know of. Now, there are some countries in Asia that have signed on with the EU for the Multilateral Investment Court alternative. That's Vietnam, Singapore itself. Can you say something about Singapore's posture on this and the popularity of alternatives to arbitration like the multilateral court in Asia?
Singapore is always pragmatic. So their solution to most problems is do everything that you can and then figure out how to make them as aligned as possible and then problem solved. So if you have to sign on to an investment court in one deal and not an investment court in another deal, that's no problem. We'll sort out how we solve those two parallel systems. That's fine. If you want to try to merge them some way or you want to push your weight in favor of one or the other, we'll do that too. Like, they're very pragmatic about this. Solve it however you have to, but keep, and I think this is key for Singapore, keep the momentum going around integration, because it's a very trade dependent place. And if you don't have trade, then you end up with economic disaster, as we're seeing under COVID. You have real sharp declines in GDP, in particular exports, but also GDP. And so that is a problem for Singapore. So whatever it takes to keep that ball moving forward, we'll do it. That's the sort of Singapore attitude.
Great. So let me start with some of the questions. So from a professor here who teaches in the US, May Nugent, how do you expect RCEP and its cumulative rules of origin, how will they impact the US's ability to effectively impose tariffs on Chinese goods?
So I think it's a great question. There's a couple things embedded in that. The first is that RCEP's rules of origin mean that you will create products in Asia for Asia. Now you can say to me, well, we've had lots of trade in Asia and it's been going on for a while. What's the difference? And I would say, yes, we've had a lot of trade in Asia, mostly raw materials, parts and components. So you develop, your smartphone with parts from across Asia, and then it goes to China, gets assembled, and then it gets shipped out. And the final markets for the phone, this is an older model, so this is more common in most of Asia, but the new models start in the US and Europe, which are, again, still far more lucrative. But over time, you will start to create products for Asia with Asian supply chains that match Asia, because the benefits of doing so are significant. And many of the impediments that have stopped firms from creating Asian products for Asia are going away, including tariff challenges, difficulties around services movements, investment restrictions, et cetera. So you're going to have better operating conditions in Asia for Asia. Now, that is deeply problematic for firms that are not in Asia, because what you can't do, you can still use RCEP if you're an American company, but you have to be in Asia. So your Asian headquarter, Asian affiliate, whatever, they can make things here in Asia for Asia. But what you can't do is sit in Iowa and make a thing and then send it to Asia, right? This is a problem, because if you do, you end up having to pay significantly higher tariffs, your services restrictions, I mean, the whole thing just gets very complicated. So it is going to be harder for non-Asian firms to compete in Asia. You will have to be in Asia to do it. There is a little bit of a catch to this, which I should mention, which is some of the rules of origin in RCEP, they're very liberal, like surprising, I think shockingly liberal, which is you, depending on the product, 40% value content from within RCEP. So you can import still 60% of the content for something from outside of Asia, which means that if you want to sit in the United States and make whatever is the components for the phone, some of those can still come in and be assembled from Iowa into here, assembled, et cetera. But it will be harder. And once firms start to shift their supply chains to be RCEP specific, I think it will be harder and harder for non-RCEP firms to get embedded into that ecosystem of creating products and services for Asia. So I think it is, in the longer run, a real challenge for the United States. And it's especially hard for the US because it has almost no agreements in Asia. It has a deal with South Korea, with Japan, with Singapore and Australia. That's it. That's it. And no agenda to do anything different in the near term. Every day that goes by, integration happens around existing Asian agreements, and the United States is not part of it. It is a problem for the US. It's a problem for American companies.
So here's a question from another trade expert, that's Tim Webster. Can you elaborate on what is a worker-centric trade policy? And he says, sounds like protectionism, higher tariffs, perhaps resort to the NAFTA or FTA mechanisms on workers' rights, which we have not really used up till now. So can you say what that means? And I guess I throw in Buy America provisions, which Biden seems to be in favor of.
Enthusiastic about. I mean, there are a lot of people, especially here in Asia, who say, what's the difference between Trump and Biden on trade? What's the difference between Trump, Buy America, and Biden's worker-centered policies? They could be exactly the same. They could be just as much worker-centric, high tariffs on imports as the Trump administration. And I think that is, again, a bit of a concern. And the focus on enforcement in existing FTAs is going to be deeply damaging, I think, in Asia, because it means that you have to smack again US allies and say you are not following worker-centric policies by allowing labor to organize, whatever the thing is that you're not doing. But this is the wrong group of people, I would say, to be yelling at. You should be yelling at people who are not doing what you want, who are not part of an agreement with you. Like, this just doesn't make any sense to me to yell at the wrong people. But that's where they're going to go. It's going to be heavy on enforcement for the US. And that makes it even harder for the United States to re-engage with everyone else, because everyone else will say, wow, like, why would I want that? Thank you very much. That sounds horrible. I don't want the US to be all up in my business about whether or not the factory floor in a factory that has 12 employees got to unionize. Like, I don't want that. And they look at things like the US side letter that it had signed with Vietnam for TPP, and they will say, thank you again, no. That was horrible. So if I don't follow the rules as the United States sees it, 7 years in, they just shut me off from all of the benefits I was supposed to have. It is not a desirable outcome for many governments in the region, even those that are actually quite dependent on the US market. They might say, you know, actually, frankly, Asia is taking off. We have agreements with the Europeans, you know, we'll just say goodbye to the United States if they're going to be difficult. Again, the world is big. There's a lot of places we could do trade if we needed to. Maybe we start expanding our alternatives.
So you don't see the Europeans going down this route of worker-centric trade policy?
Well, the Europeans are interesting. So after RCEP got signed, I have done nonstop conversations in Europe, European Parliament, like multiple times, different foreign ministries, trade ministries across the member states, because they're extremely interested in RCEP. They see the challenges, they see what that means. But the questions always come in, what about labor and the environment? It's not in RCEP, why not? And I had to say, well, because at the moment in Asia, these are not priorities. Or they're priorities, but they're not priorities of the group. And the group was not willing to let the agreement go down while they tried to sort out labor and environment commitments. And so they're not there, which leads the Europeans especially to say, well, wait a second, that's a key pillar. Those are key pillars of our policy. What happens if a big 30% of the world doesn't share our views on this? Does that mean we have to change our views? Does that mean we have to adjust our policies? I think the Europeans haven't figured out how they're going to resolve this yet, but it does flag a challenge. It flags a challenge for Europe, and it flags a challenge for the US. If you're going to talk about labor and the environment, and only labor and the environment, you will find, I think, more of a challenge in Asia than people anticipate, because it's just not front and center for, again, it's not to say that they want to wreck the environment. That's not where I'm going, but that's not front and center in trade policy.
So that does tee up another question in the Q&A, which is mitigation of climate change. I think it's quite likely that members of the Democrats in Congress will push for mitigation of climate change policies in future trade agreements, and it might even be a precondition in any extension of trade promotion authority. Is that a no-go in Asia?
That's going to be tough. But I'll tell you where Asia is really going to struggle. You know, things like the European carbon border adjustment tax is going to be an unholy mess in Asia, because it means that firms in Asia will have to figure out how do they price carbon and how do they factor that in at European levels, not at Asian level, at European levels, such that it satisfies the Europeans. They deal with this tax issue. I mean, this has potentially catastrophic effects on a lot of Asian markets when they have to suddenly equalize to Europe. And the same thing I think is likely with the US. If the US says, as a precondition for agreement with us, you have to sign on to these very heavy, very intrusive environmental and or labor standards with heavy enforcement, I think a lot of governments will just say, actually, you know what, that sounds lovely, but nah, we'll either negotiate for 20 years on this and maybe you'll change your mind, or no, thank you. You're not going to get a lot of takers. And I think at the moment, the United States needs to try, I realize this is tough and politically it's really hard on the Hill, but the United States needs to try to meet members a bit closer to where they're at, and then try, of course, to level them up and do all this other stuff. It's super important. Then come in and impose requirements, standards, et cetera, in places where they are not.
So we have another question from the Q&A, and that's about the TPP. Could anybody trust China to comply if they sign up to the existing arrangement? How confident are you that the enforcement mechanisms would withstand China coming in and not really following the rules?
It's a great question. I mean, it's a risk. It's definitely a risk. Anytime you sign on a new member, it's a risk, because the original TPP, everyone could sort of count on the United States being a backstop. So I didn't have to pay so much attention to what everyone else was doing, because the US would do it. They would manage enforcement. They would make sure that everyone was following the rules and implementing appropriately. With the US gone, we've had a much looser approach to implementation and to enforcement. That is a challenge in the current membership. And the more that you expand out into members that are less enthusiastic about the objectives, and I'm not talking China here, I'm just talking about anybody else who is sort of borderline CPTPP entry and then says, you know what, I'll do it. They're less likely to follow all of the rules. I mean, it's a complicated deal, frankly, and it's hard to keep track of all the rules, and the implementation is a challenge. And so I think that's a problem. And then when you add in the big players like a China, even more challenging. What are the odds that, Singapore will stand up to China and say, actually, you didn't really follow 11.4.3. So please do so. Like, this is, I find it hard to imagine that would happen. It could, but it is hard. It is hard. But it's true. I would say this is true for all agreements, including the WTO, even though we have a dispute system. If I don't want to follow the rules, I don't have to follow the rules. So, every trade agreement is really a bit of a sort of, leap of faith. I believe that you will follow the rules. You've promised to follow the rules. We're all going to do our level best to follow the rules. If we don't do that, no enforcement mechanism is going to make us.
So I guess
they're not that strong.
So let's just ask you, do you think China has followed the rules in the WTO?
They are excellent at following the written rules and then finding all of the areas that are not written. I mean, the WTO rule book, frankly, is old and thin. I mean, there's a lot of ways to think creatively about expanding. The sentence could be expanded to cover everything, but you can also say the sentence is the sentence. And so what I think China has done a pretty good job of, I think, is following what the sentence says. Now, they don't always sign on to all of those other expanded definitions and the ways in which we might interpret it and so forth. And they're very good at finding ways around, things that are unclear or just non-existent. And I think that's more, for me, that's a bit more of what China has done than deliberately taken a rule and then broken it.
Right. So in this speaker series, the issues that have come up the most often when we talk about China and the WTO are Chinese SOEs and how they're perhaps unique and are not captured wholly by the WTO rules or the rulings issued by the dispute settlement appellate mechanism, appellate body. And the other lingering issue, and I'm curious whether you think it's a significant issue or just politically significant, is China's country, basically developing country status in the WTO. You want to say a word about those two questions?
I'll take the second one first. So the second one is not just fraught for China. So, Singapore is a developing country in the WTO. Now, this is a bit nonsense for anyone who's been here to say, wow, developing country, really? And it took me a long time to figure out why it remains a developing country. And I realized finally, and I've not had this is my own theory, I've not had it confirmed by anyone, just to be clear. I think it's because if Singapore switches to being a developed economy, then all of its existing FTAs and commitments have to be upgraded because now it's developed and developing, including across, and I think this is key, ASEAN. So it's much better for Singapore to have the flexibility to be developing in the trade space than to be reclassified as developed. And the same thing is true, has been true, or used to be true, at least with the Koreans, which is why it took them so long to decide that they were developed. I mean, I think there is a challenge here at the WTO. When do we graduate, since it's a self-declaration? I think for me, in some ways, it's a bit of a red herring because it's less urgent for me is what do you do with that status? Singapore developing, but it never takes advantage of developing country exceptions. So fine, label them developing and let them do whatever, as long as they're basically following developed country rules and implementing them appropriately. For me, this is fine. But I understand how people get nervous about the flexibilities and how often you take them and so forth. And this issue with China especially is challenging. I think at some point the WTO will have to grapple with the thresholds at which you graduate from developing to developed, or eliminate the thing. And frankly, I'd be delighted to get rid of the entire distinction, because I think it is not helpful at the WTO anymore. It's become so ossified that you can't even have a conversation with someone unless you identify whether I'm a developing country or you're a developing country, and what can we say to each other in that status. I don't think it's helpful. So I would personally like to just get rid of it and say we only care about the least developed countries because we want to help them, and they're clearly not in the same position as others. But again, it's politically fraught, and do you want to throw this on the WTO agenda? I don't know. So that was the second half of your question. And the first half of your question, now I forgot.
The Chinese SOEs. How do we think about
SOEs? Yeah, I mean, the problem with China's SOEs is we have no disciplines at the WTO. So, there just isn't, there's a whole, the WTO does a lot of things, but there are whole sections of what governments do and what economies do that are not covered by the WTO at all, including, crucially, anything digital. This is a problem, and it's becoming a bigger problem. So state-owned enterprises is an issue. Subsidies is going to be the real battle that we're about to fight for the next decade or more, I think, at the WTO on subsidies and subsidy policy. We've got new approaches to managing things that are a problem. And you'll note that there's nothing in RCEP on state-owned enterprises. And the reason for that is because they're all sinners. Basically, everyone in Asia has state-owned enterprises, however you define it. And if they didn't have them before, they've pumped them up on steroids now for COVID. So who wants to be constrained by state-owned enterprise rules in Asia? The answer is nobody. That's why it's not there. I think it's a little like it's something that needs to be tackled, but it is really hard. I mean, the TPP countries took forever to figure out what to do on state-owned enterprise. And although many people think this is a fabulous chapter, I think it has loopholes that are, as big as the outdoors. So it's nice to have, but I don't think it really gets you at tackling the challenges that you're trying to address, which is really about uncompetitive practices. Does it matter whether you're state-owned or not? I'm not certain. I think uncompetitive practices shouldn't depend on who owns you.
So here's, I think it'll be the last question, but it's a grenade, I think, in many respects. And this comes from Catherine Wilhelm, our executive director. Isn't the problem that the US for a long time made trade policy in isolation from domestic economic policy based on a theory about how domestic job loss would sort itself out? And now it's recognized widely that any new trade policy must be combined with some domestic economic policy that helps the trade loser, something more than the lame job retraining requirements. But we don't know what that should be. We only know what hasn't worked. There is talk about universal basic income, but it's still untested, highly contested. Yes, trade largely has worked for developing countries, but it's a messier situation for developed nations. Forcing the US workers to compete with Chinese workers undermines the US social contract. So part of me thinks maybe trade is an urgent issue, but as a nation, we have bigger fish to fry. It used to be that what's good for GE is good for America. That hasn't been true for a long time. I think that's pretty much a grenade at what we've been talking about. So you want to comment? And alas, we're
Sure.
at the very end.
Sure. I would say, let me just back up on trade in general. So trade, as I said, I think goes further for development and growth than anything else. But it was never a promise that everyone would benefit equally. So the idea behind trade, of course, is that we will benefit in the long run, in the aggregate, we will all benefit. But in the short run, there will be some challenges. And in the aggregate means there will still be some challenges. So across all of us, some of us are going to fall through the cracks. And so the idea with trade was always that there should be domestic level redistribution policies to sort out those short-term challenges and then handle the longer-term implications of trade. What has happened, though, is that many governments have forgotten that second part of this. They've just gone for the first part, let's open markets and see what happens. And then they haven't done the appropriate redistribution, retraining, et cetera, that is needed in order to compensate for challenges from a larger market. I think that's where the problem actually is. And I know you're absolutely right that the US trade adjustment assistance is a disaster, too small, never been right, et cetera. What I think you want to do is not call it about trade either. It's really about skills and job retraining, because it's not just trade, it's also technology shifts. It's also, new ways of living, new ways of operating. So I think what is crucial to me is a commitment to think about how do we prepare the workforce for tomorrow, whether that's domestic or foreign or a combination thereof. We have to be thinking about how do we train people for a lifetime. And it can't just be you go to high school and you're done. You go to high school and into college and you're done. It has to be this sort of lifetime training, retraining. It needs to be much more flexible. It needs to be, I don't care how or why you've lost a job, but let me figure out what we can do to support you so that you get another job. So the point should be to constantly get people churning in and out of the workforce to stay in the workforce and productive for as long as possible. That has nothing to do with trade necessarily, because you have the same disruptive forces domestically. Even if you walled yourself off and you said, I'm going to practice the North Korean autarky, you're still going to have disruptions from trade, but it would really be about trade and economic issues, right? So I don't think you should say, let me say trade is a horrible villain and domestic is different. I think you want to say, what are the implications of competitive economies? Full stop. Domestic, foreign, whatever. How do we make ourselves better positioned for the future for that? And unless and until you sort that problem out, and that's worker skills and training, it's about upgrading your economy and infrastructure, developing that ecosystem in order to be competitive, developing next generation ideas, protecting them. There's a lot of stuff that goes into that, but basically that's what the focus should be. How are we positioned to compete in the future? Make that happen. Then it doesn't matter whether it's domestic or foreign trade. That you're now better positioned for the future than you would have been if you said, we're just going to close the borders and somehow magically we're going to get more competitive.
Thank you. That'll have to be the final answer, as if this were Jeopardy, alas. Also, I will say, I'll put in a good word for you being one of those 800 confirmed new Biden appointees. You'd be excellent, I think, on dealing with the Hill and on these issues.
I think they would find too many blunt comments and I would be shot down in confirmation hearings in 5 seconds. They would say, nope, look what you said here. You were on BBC and you said that. Yeah.
Well, thank you for being so engaging on this and very much forceful and persuasive. Thanks very much and hope we'll have you back at some point soon.
Okay.
Take care.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.